welcome everyone to tonight's event with Joanne M. Harris and Ed Cox. I am Lucy Holland. I am the author of this book, Sister Song, fun, which you've probably seen around the place. And tonight, though, I'm honoured to be talking to these two wonderful authors about their brand new books. Before we get started, remember, if you've got any questions that you want to ask, then put them in the Q&A down the bottom, and we'll get to those at the end. Okay, so tonight we are celebrating two books that capture the essence of the other world that sits so very near to our own. Both are meditations on the often seductive power of stories, the allure and the peril of realms that aren't governed by human rules. Joanne's Honeycomb, which I have right here, beautiful illustrated book. It is a novel of interwoven tales, as equally enchanting as they are chilling in their depiction of the silken folk and their trickster king. Ed's novel, The Would-Be Queen, is part fantastical adventure, part fairy tale, in which a young librarian is pulled into the realm and the role of reluctant hero. I am going to hand you over to the authors themselves, just to give you a little introduction in their own words to the realms that they've created, and then we'll get stuck into some of the ideas, discussing some of the ideas that I think underpin both books. So I'm thinking of handing over to Ed first, because I just want to congratulate him on this fantastic punning title. I love a pun, and it took me quite a long time to realise it was indeed a pun.
Well, thank you very much. I have had a couple of people ask me if I intended, if I know what the title meant, which I find kind of funny, because I was clever enough to write the book, but not to understand my own title, kind of thing. But yes, thank you very much. I love a good dad joke. There you go. It's allowed.
So tell us a little bit about The Would-Be Queen. Is it a fairy tale? I mean, I think it was kind of part adventure story, part fairy tale. It had aspects of both. In your own words, what do you think what's this book about?
Well, it's very much inspired by fairy tales and that kind of feel to things. It's also inspired by the idea of friendship with broken relationships and how they might be mended. Somebody said today, actually, in one of their congratulations, that it's like almost like a love letter to love as well, and I like that. I do believe in that. But really, it's an adventure. It's the realm is. It's my version of the land of fairy. It sits, as you say, very, very close to a version of our world, where once upon a time we had a belief in a race called the Olden folk, who are heavily inspired by the Roman pantheon. And the Romans, I live in Colchester, so I have almost an affinity for the Romans, and that part of our history. And it's a story about doing what's right, even when you've been given every reason not to do what's right, and also when you really don't feel like you're the sort of person to go out there and do right. I think, does that sum things up? I feel like I'm rambling now.
No, I think that's a lovely thing, and I love that you talked about the book as being, more positive. It was a fun, nice book to write, and it has a lovely message about mending broken relationships, which I think is something that everyone can get behind.
Well, thank you. And it is a brighter story. The last book I wrote, The Song of Sycamore, which I've said before, is probably the bleakest thing I've ever written. And I think after writing that, I needed to write something which was more me with a smile on my face, and hopefully, it'll give people smiles, the reader smiles when they're reading along.
Wonderful. And Joanne, do you want to tell us a little bit about Honeycomb, what kind of book it is, and what can readers expect?
Well, Honeycomb is something that wasn't supposed to be a book at all. I started initially writing it as stories on Twitter. I wasn't even going to keep the stories. They were supposed to kind of just go off into the Twitter sphere and mix with the current events and the conversations that had sparked the stories off. And it started when I was in my shed, actually. I'm in my shed now. And at the time, my husband was just building it for me, and I was reporting on what it was doing, and then I reported on moving in, and then I started to write about the shed as if it were a character. And one day I came into the shed and it was full of lacewings, and I didn't know why. It was in the middle of winter. There was no reason these lacewings should just have appeared, and they were on every surface. It was ridiculous. And I said, obviously, there is an uncanny reason to this. And I invented this character on the spot and wrote a story about him, the character called the Lacewing King, who was, in my mind, just a kind of swarm of lacewings in a long coat. And I wrote a story about him, and it was funny. And I kept on writing these stories. And people started to say to me that I ought to keep them. And people, in fact, kept them for me and sent them to me and said, I really liked your story. I've kept it. Here it is in case you want it. And little by little, characters started to emerge, and the stories were supposed to stand alone, but it became clear to me that there were returning characters and overarching themes and storylines. And by the time I had 100 odd of them, I realized that I had 3/4 of a novel which could be pulled together very quickly. And so that's what I did. And I thought, these stories are written in a certain kind of way. They are written in a very particular concise style, because, you can't say an awful lot of stuff on Twitter all at once. They were written as fairy stories in quite an old style, but they were all new stories. So I thought, what if I get together with an illustrator and make a collection of fairy stories disguised as a novel, or a novel disguised as a collection of fairy stories in the style of these old illustrated fairy books that we loved when we were children, illustrated by people like Arthur Rackham. And what if I did something like that, something that was new, but which felt nostalgic and looked beautiful, and reinvented some of the fairy situations that we think we know, because the Lacewing King is, in a sense, he is the king of the fairy, but he is also a trickster character. He is also a sort of in charge of the insect world. And my fairies are very dark fairies. They're not like the Victorian fairies that have been sweetened and made small and cute. They're more like the Celtic fairies, which are dark and a bit troubling. And so it's kind of coming of age story for my central character, who starts off tremendously spoilt and selfish and cruel, and who eventually, after many travels and many adventures, is at least partially redeemed in a way that was satisfying to me.
Well, I'm glad that we're actually discussing these two books together, because I feel like they share quite a few similar themes and characters. And the one that jumped out for me is your discussion of these realms, the concept of the other world, which is something that I've been reading about a lot lately, because I'm drawing on a lot of Celtic and Irish myth. Ed, your strange ground, I love the twinning concept, that there is strange ground beneath and strange ground by, and the strange ground by is our version of the town. But this idea of a world underneath another world, I mean, that really reminded me of the she mounds, the fairy mounds of Ireland. Like, where did that come from for you?
Do you know Strange Ground is a real place?
Okay, that's cool.
Well, I'm positive it's a real place. Here's the thing, I love the signs around the small villages and settlements in England, which are always twinned with somewhere I can't pronounce in Europe. And I love that idea. And I started thinking about, what if you had these signs twinned with somewhere magical, And my wife and I, we were driving quite a few years ago now, and we just drove through this little place, and it was called Strange Ground, all one word, written as one word, Strange Ground. And I remember, and it was so small, this place. If you started your car at one end of it, you would have driven out of it before you reached fourth gear, and just Strange Ground. So I took a photograph of the sign. I said to my wife, I'm going to write a story about this one day. And I cannot find that photograph, and I can find no evidence of Strange Ground online either. I'm pretty sure it's around the Norwich area. But now I'm honestly worried that I might have dreamt the place, because I can't find it anywhere. And as to the inspiration for merging that in with creating the realm, and having a place underneath a place, or whether there's a sea kind of dividing the places. A lot of the stuff that I wrote didn't have a lot of research going into it. A lot of the stuff in there is more based on my memory of things that I remember, and how they've kind of morphed into me making stuff up and making them fit. But you know, sorry, I feel like I'm rambling on here, but I do need to say this. There was a big inspiration for how I wanted this book to feel and how I wanted it to sound. Quite a few years ago, I was coming home on holiday. I was coming back on my own, and my flight got delayed by a couple of hours. So I found a cafe, and I took my notebook and pen and just sat down and thought, I'm just going to write something. There's no pre-planning to it. I'm just going to write something. And I started writing this scene. Now, if anybody reads the book, it's the scene in the book where Beck and Ebby meet for the first time, those two characters. And I got to the end of that, writing it, and it was a really good writing session. And it appears in the book pretty much as it did in the notebook. I realized that there was a lot more before it, and there was a lot more after it, and I had a novel idea. But at that time, I was writing The Watcher of Dead Time, and I already knew that my next book would be The Song of the Sycamore. Now, skip forward a couple of years. I'm on a plane going on holiday again. It's a 4-hour flight, and the book I took with me to read on that flight was A Pocket Full of Crows by someone called Joanne Harris, you know? And now I'm a notoriously slow reader, but that book, I fell in love with it as soon as I started reading it. And I read it on the 4-hour flight. It was just the pages of a skimming past one. And I can remember reading that. And I remember thinking, that idea that I wrote down, that scene, this book here, this is how it needs to feel. The texture, the smells, the movement, everything that's going on. This is how that story needs to feel. And that, Joanne, was the moment that I decided The Would-Be Queen would be my next theme after the Song of the Sycamore. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah,
So,
well, don't you love these
I
stories?
loved The Would-Be Queen. I thought it was beautiful.
Well, thank you very much. But there was a big inspiration. That might not have been my next book had I not read A Pocket Full of Crows. And I mean that genuinely. I love that book. In fact, I might even hold my hand up and say that that's my favorite thing that I've ever read of yours. Aren't I a sweetie?
Well, it's embarrassed me now.
Well, I'm sorry about that, but it's a genuine compliment. It really is. And so,
well, it's a lovely compliment. Thank you. It's really kind of you to say so. But it's funny, isn't it? These crossovers of things. I don't think they're accidental. I think you did see that place, but it's now gone somewhere else. It's obviously it's migrated somewhere else into the Honeycomb world because you only needed to see it that one time. Maybe somebody else needs to see it next time, and it's on where they can find it.
I like that. That's a lovely idea. I'm going to believe in that. Yes, absolutely.
I love the idea of the Honeycomb worlds, and I was going to ask you about the idea of the 9 worlds and how much was that inspired by Norse mythology, the 9 worlds of Norse mythology?
Yes, I've been writing about Norse myths for some time in my rune books and my Loki books. And the books that I wrote, Pocket Full of Crows being one of them, loosely around the child ballads, were also supposed to be in that world. But I realized as I was writing these books, I realized that I was expanding that universe slowly, and I was adding little cells to it. And I realized that actually the 9 worlds are actually a lot more than 9 worlds. It's just that at the time, the Norse folk could only see 9 of them, but give them time and they'll see the rest. And so I realized that I was writing about a kind of fairy tale multiverse, which included our world and the world of the Norse people and the world of the fairy tales that we know because they're part of our inherited folklore, and the world of the child ballads. And I managed to create in my mind a sort of logistic around it. And the messengers who go from one part of the honeycomb to the other are, of course, the bees. And the reason I chose bees in a way was partly because my silken folk were all akin to the insect world, but also because there's so much wonderful folklore and mythology around bees that I wanted to use it. And also because I told myself that if I was writing new folklore, I would need a new introductory phrase for my folklore. And I didn't want to use Once Upon a Time because it has been taken and it belongs to a different kind of storytelling. So I made up this phrase. In my first story, there is a story the bees used to tell, which makes it hard to disbelieve. And that became my Once Upon a Time. And all my stories, when I was writing them on Twitter, began with this. And so this theme of stories and what they mean and how stories allow people to travel between worlds became kind of an intrinsic part of the core of the book that I was writing.
And you've worked with some other artists and musicians, haven't you, to create some of these stories as songs? If people go on Bandcamp, they can have a listen to them.
Yes, well, because I had the wonderful Charles Vess to do my illustrations, but he had an enormous queue of pieces of work that he needed to do. And so I knew that it would take him a little while to get around to my project. And I started to think while I was waiting, what if these stories went somewhere else? Because stories, I think, are volatile things, and very often they don't like to stay on the page. They like to go into different media. And so I thought, I'm having them illustrated. Why couldn't I put them on stage, make them part of a show, put them to music? And so the band that I've been in forever, and I wrote the music to these extended storytelling song pieces, and took them as part of a show to various festivals. And we did 2 CDs. And yes, if you go on Bandcamp, you'll find them, or on my website. But it was interesting to see how the nature of those stories just wanted to be something other than just on the page, because obviously telling a story feels very different to reading a story, or even reading a story aloud. And I thought, how many ways can I find for these stories to travel?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm glad we've come on to this, because actually it's something that I wanted to ask you both, a bit about the difference between oral storytelling and written storytelling, because we have, Ed has a librarian protagonist who's a bit of a king in his own literary kingdom. And the written word for him plays quite a big role in his quest. I mean, he has a book that he carries around that gives him advice when he needs it. But Joanne has talked about modeling Honeycomb on the oral tradition of storytelling. And the original fairy tales had a fluidity to them, that allowed them to be in dialogue kind of with social issues of the day. So these are two, I feel like they intersect quite nicely, but they're also their own separate mediums. So each of you, I mean, what drew you to explore these particular aspects of storytelling? We have the oral tradition in one hand, and we have the kind of more written tradition in the other hand.
I personally, I'm always interested by how writing stuff down, telling stories, can alter a story in itself, and that's a recurring thing that happens in The Would-Be Queen, is that you'll hear a story about an event and then you'll find out that it's true, and it happened how it happened, but details, people are swapped for books and stories and that kind of thing, and everybody has their own story. Excuse me. But I'm also interested in the information, whether it's true or not, that you get on things like YouTube. You kind of have this storm, I call it, of mini myths, of urban legends, of conspiracy theories that, and I hear people talking about them all around, as if they're the gospel truth, that, they've just heard somebody on YouTube say something that cannot be true, it cannot be true, but they're believing in it. And I like the idea of having stories that can be embellished, that can be wild, but always carry that seed of truth somewhere along the line, even if it is carrying somebody's fear of the unknown or something like that. That there's a reason behind stories. that whether they tell the truth or not, or even if they're hiding the truth, they're kind of quite telling. Sorry, I've lost my way in that one. I forgot.
No, I think that's absolutely it. I think there's a kind of modern oral tradition which exists partly on the internet, which is why Twitter is so interesting, because Twitter has a uniquely vocal quality to me. I mean, YouTube obviously does, but we have all these oral traditions of storytellers that we think of as being in the past. And Lucy, you said something about original fairy tales. The beauty of those fairy tales is that there never was an original version. There were as many versions as there were storytellers, because of course, as soon as you write something down on the page, and I love the written word, but what it does is it freezes the story in time. It's like a photograph. It's like a photograph of somebody walking down a road. You freeze that one story, that one moment. You have no idea what it would have become if you hadn't written it down, or what it might be becoming in a sort of parallel world where the story's still being told. And so the oral tradition has this lovely fluidity, because it changes depending on who's telling the story, what happens to be happening at the time as well, because current events tend to enter in the story. And Lucy, of course, Sister Song is a wonderful example of a retelling of a child ballad, a murder ballad that people would have passed from storyteller to storyteller possibly over centuries. And it has been recreated to reflect something completely new, completely topical. Because actually, if you don't retell stories, they die. Eventually, they cease to be relevant. And so I love the living aspect of storytelling and the sort of dynamic aspect that it has. And I love the way that we think of books as being generally an intellectual pursuit. But storytelling, that is straight from the people. Folklore is the history of the folk, people who didn't necessarily even know how to read. But boy, they understood the power of stories.
Yeah. Do you know, that's fascinating listening to that. And it brings to mind that, stories reinventing themselves, or different storytellers telling their own versions of the story. I think there's a good example right here in this very panel. My book, The Song of the Sycamore, and Joanne's book, Orphea, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. They're both heavily inspired by the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. But if people were to read both those books, they couldn't find two different stories. They're kind of very different in style, and very different in feel. So I like listening to what Joanne said just then, that stories need to reinvent themselves, that people need to tell them differently, but there's a core there, the heart of the story.
You both keep anticipating my questions, so this is great. We've already started to talk about this layering of stories, and the constant kind of reinvention and the need for that. But I was wondering whether it's possible for stories to become self-aware, to gain this kind of metafictional element, to take on a life of their own, to see themselves as constructs.
Oh, that's a big one.
I told you I had a metaphysical question.
Yeah.
Didn't you? I think they all do, in a sense, because every reader will read a story in their own particular way. Every storyteller will tell a story in their own particular way, and it's a dynamic process. And so there are lots of opportunities to kind of look outside of the story and to go, you know what, I know what you're doing, but I'm going to buy into it anyway. I mean, when I was writing Honeycomb as stories on Twitter, one of the things I didn't do for a very long time was thread my tweets. And sometimes, well, pretty much every time, I would have somebody who didn't know me going, why don't you thread your tweets? I had to go to your feed and look for the story that way. You could just have threaded it. But I didn't want it to do that, because I wanted the randomness, or the not quite randomness, of Twitter to be part of the narrative process. And that wasn't something that you could keep. That was something that had to be ephemeral. But also, if I was telling a story about a mad king who lived in a golden tower, who had a beautiful wife who hated him, and Trump was flying off to Mar-a-Lago on another part of the feed, people would go, ooh, I see what she did there. And that's pretty much exactly what you just described. But that can also happen outside the internet too, because that's exactly what the oral tradition allows for. A storyteller will go into a different town, will look at what's going on, and will bring in strands of what happens to be current events or current concerns into the story they're telling to make it connect more, to make it more relevant. And people will see this and they will buy into it, because that is the contributory nature of the audience in storytelling. And the nice thing about storytelling live, one of the things I've found with performing with the band, is that you get that immediate reaction with the audience, which you can never get when you're just writing a book and you know that maybe a year later it will find its audience and you'll have to wait to find out what they thought by looking on Amazon or Goodreads or something. When you're telling a story, it's right there. You surprise them and you can hear the response. You can make people cry. I love making people cry with story time. It's one of my favorite things. It's the greatest flattery that you can give a storyteller if you're moved to that extent. But there's this contribution that can only be made by the audience, and they bring all that.
Yeah. Do you think that, you know, the social media and modern technology has played a role in this, in opening up, opening up our minds to possibly, you know, hearing stories from different places in the world, for example?
Oh, I think that over my time on Twitter, I've definitely had my eyes open to cultural phenomenon, to problems that people suffer, you know, looking at this as a kind of straight white man, you know, and a lot of the problems that I don't incur because of who I am. I certainly think the stories that I've heard have certainly expanded my empathy to things that I just had no idea. You know, you just kind of look at Twitter some days and I think, Christ, I just don't know I'm born, you know. But I also think that, you know, I've spoken to people from different parts of the world who have kind of said, oh, it's interesting that you put something that way, and they've told me about, I don't know, I remember somebody from America, Native America, telling me about spirit animals and things that I didn't know about spirit animals, you know, and that kind of thing. And that was just wonderful to have somebody take the time. And I was asking questions, you know, and they were giving me feedback. Really nice. So yes, I think is the answer to your question. The simple answer is yes, you know.
Yeah, I think it depends on whose stories you're listening to, but anybody who collects stories, it's a wonderful way to broaden your knowledge of experiences that you couldn't possibly have had, and to understand the world, because actually the folklore that we are used to is by and large European folklore from a certain kind of culture. But actually, you know, with the internet, if you're willing to go in search of it and to follow people whose experiences aren't your own, you can draw into your storytelling bank all sorts of things which you might not ever have known before, and you can learn to participate in different experiences. You know, how would I possibly have known a lot of the things that I've learned just by talking to people on Twitter who've had very different lives, who live in very different places?
The internet as a force for good, for once.
Well, I think this last year or so, with things like FaceTime and Zoom and connecting people, I think the internet did come into its own, you know, because we had got to a place where it was kind of very, very much about how it could be vile, that connectivity between people, how it could, you know, the downside of it. And then all of a sudden it was the thing that, you know, it meant that we didn't have to keep pockets full of changes and go down to the phone box and with the old rotary dials and that kind of thing, here right now, getting to talk to the two of you when we're all in different parts of the country, and just to have a chat about books. It's great, in the comfort of my living room, where I've got a nice iron shirt on, where from the waist down I'm wearing tatty old shorts and slippers.
Now, why did you tell us that? We'd never have known, Ed. Well, I would like to circle back a bit to talk a little bit more about your books, because I think they're both fantastic, and they're both fantastic in different ways. But one thing that I feel like they both address is a human fascination with fairy, with the other realm. And I think that it's very hard to put your finger on what it is, because the idea of traveling out of your own world, governed by familiar rules, to somewhere else, to somewhere other, that holds both an allure and a terror, because these stories, of people going out into a place where they've never been before, it's the realm, the other, they never return unchanged from their experiences. Do you feel like this it's kind of like the heart of our obsession, our fascination with fairy, the terror and the beauty?
I think so. Yeah, and that's why I have the character of Eddie Wren, somebody who's lived his life in stories. Terror and fascination are the two driving thoughts in his head as he moves into the realm, quite clearly, and it takes him a while to realize that, oh, actually, I'm probably better suited to this place than I am to the other place, where I didn't have friends, where I didn't really understand people, where I didn't, so I think there's a kind of moving out of the comfort zone into his comfort zone. I think that's the problem with Eddie Wren, the main character in the story, is that at some point in his life, he got taken out of his comfort zone. And he thought what was normal should have been his comfort zone, and it wasn't. And moving into the realm, I think, with the help of character May, he found somewhere that actually started feeling more like home to him. And that was a very important aspect that I wanted to put in. I didn't want that. I didn't want the story about trying to find a way home. I didn't want the story to be about. I wanted it to be about the differences between the two worlds. One has evolved. Our world has evolved. The realm hasn't. And I think that the key difference there is one is more geared towards science. The other is geared towards magic. And so Eddie is kind of seen one, but he's straddling these worlds and he's leaning towards the other with terror and fascination.
Yeah, but I feel like your world is slightly, in a way, less other than Joanne's world, because I feel like Ebby arrives in this place and then there's a bar, and he gets his money stolen, and it's all quite, it feels to for me that it's not. I felt more comforted in your world than I was in Joanne's world, which is incredible. Which I love. I love that aspect of it. I think that you read this. I read this as a story particularly that I loved is the girl who falls in love with the Lacewing King, and this her obsession to see the folk kind of results in her cutting off her own eyelids. That.
Yes, well, the thing about the silken folk is that they're not exactly in another world. They're just not visible to most people in our world. And so there is this suggestion of a liminal space, which is so close to our space that, if only we were able to see it, we would be able to see everything that's there. And I think there's something quite troubling in the idea that, there's all this stuff going on that we can't see because we are basically the sightless folk. And we're just not capable. And so my silken folk and the ordinary people, the people like us, live very much side by side. And there's a kind of reciprocal fascination, because the Lacewing King is fascinated by human people, particularly because he knows how to wind them up. But later on, we find his granddaughter, the Barefoot Princess, who is left in charge of the kingdom. spends all her time in the library reading about human beings, and plastic and trains and concrete all seem terribly fascinating and new to her. And when finally she does make it into another world, and the first thing she sees is a train, it's, you know, it's as if she saw a unicorn, except to her a unicorn would not have been particularly fascinating. So we have this kind of reciprocal fascination between these two people, but very few of them ever meet.
I feel like before we can go on to questions, that I need to ask you both about bees. Bees are they feature heavily in both books. I mean, Ed's Strange Grounds ruling house is the wood bee, and you have plenty of characters that are referred to by their house names like Dragonfly and Kingfisher. And Joanne, of course, has characters, the damselfly and the spider queens, the lacewing king. I want to know where the idea to incorporate such strong nature imagery came from. I mean, why bees?
Because I think, for me, bees are one of the greatest unseen kindnesses that we should be taking care of. You know, there's this threat that their numbers are lessening. They're dying. There's not as many each year as there should be. But just this migration, it's the migration of bees. I think, you know, that they will go to a flower, they will move on, and the world will grow with them. You know, they'll pass on something. It's almost like pollen becomes fairy dust or something, you know. And there was a moment when I was writing the book where I was thinking about using bees as the messengers that could travel between both sides. But it became more obvious that I needed something that was more related to the sea, because the sea plays quite a big part in the story. So it became seagulls. And then also I just had that most awesome of all dad jokes for the title. So that had to stay in, you know. But yeah, there is a kind of, I love bees, I do, and I will always save a bee if I see a bee. Wasps, on the other hand, I'll fight to the death, but bees I will always save.
Wasps have their place in nature too.
Oh, I know, but they're just so nasty. They're always grumpy, and they're always, you know, swearing at you.
Yeah, not a fan. Definitely not a fan of wasps.
No.
I love your
And
eyes.
you can hear them as well. They make a particular sound, wasps, and you just know the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. A wasp is close.
I love the fact that you said, you know, you started that by saying unseen kindness. I love the idea of that, and I love the interconnect. I think that resonates in your book, the mending, and I also like the way that Joanne has used the idea of bees and honeycomb and the interconnectedness of our creative landscapes. It's a lovely metaphor.
Well, and bees have such a rich folklore. There are so many stories around bees that it didn't take a huge leap in my mind to create a version of bees that also disseminated stories and went between the worlds, and they are the ones who create these connections. Because if the world is a honeycomb, which is something that becomes clear during the telling of these stories, then who gets to visit all the cells of the honeycomb? It's got to be the bees. And the idea that fairies are also linked to the insect world, that's not an enormous leap either, because, you know, there are so many stories told about insects being fairies in disguise, or people who don't believe in fairies who just assume that people saw insects. You know, what if what they saw was exactly what the fairies wanted them to see? And what if the fairies were not these little Victorian delicate things, but actually these entities, these rather sinister entities that are everywhere, but we don't notice them because insects are just insects, and we don't often understand how their communities work.
Oh yeah, I think there's definite otherness about as well, which is always going to be quite cool. You know.
Yeah, insects are a good choice for that, because I do think that they are not as popular part of the animal kingdom as, say, squirrels and birds. Something kind of sinister about it. You know, I'm thinking of the Spider Queen.
Well,
As
yes,
someone who
quite.
doesn't like spiders.
Well, when I was a kid, I don't know why, but my grandfather gave me these two very old boxes of insect collections. I think he'd had them at his school when he was a young schoolmaster, and they somehow ended up in my playroom, and I was at the same time fascinated and horrified by them. And they were there. They weren't butterflies, they were just these enormous beetles with giant claws, and I used to kind of cover them up with a blanket and just peer at them from time to time because they were so frightening. And I made up all these stories about them, and so I'm sure that they were the kind of the early version of my silken folk, because they just seemed to have these personalities. And they were very old. The collections must have been at least 100 years old when I got them. And so they had this kind of secret value. And there was also the idea that they were probably all extinct by then too. And so they had a slightly magical resonance to them. But yes, I could totally believe that they were fairies or goblins of some sort.
I'm going to be really careful next time I see a fly, or just I don't like to squish them anyway.
Tip your hat, Joanne knows.
So I have a couple of questions lined up now from the audience. So the first one is to Joanne. Sharon says, I have been amazed at your output over the past year. How have you managed to write and bring out so many books during COVID times? Do you have a set schedule, or are you always working away on the next book?
Well, yes, I'm always working on the next thing. I don't have a set schedule, and what gets brought out isn't really always my choice. Sometimes it's the publisher's choice, and so the publisher had a number of things that they happened to bring out during lockdown. But actually, you know, lockdown, I've been very lucky in lockdown in that I haven't lost my ability to write, which some authors did, and I can understand why, because it was a worrying time and an unsettled time. But actually, I found it easier in some ways to shut myself away in the shed and work than to have to face all the uncertainty of what was going on. And so not only was I more inclined to kind of shut myself away and write, but also I had more time because all my events got cancelled. And so I didn't have to travel or do festivals or do gigs, and all this stuff that was there in my diary just all got cancelled. So I had to do something to fill the time, and I can spend an awful lot of time watching TV and making toast if pushed to it, but yeah, I found it relatively easy to keep going, for which I'm grateful, because it wasn't a given.
What about you, Ed?
I'm always writing. My output isn't that great. It takes me a long time to finish. The Would Be Queen, I think it's probably a couple of years writing. I have to use the energy that I can put into focus and concentration has a kind of a limited period every day, which could be an hour, it could be a few hours, it could be, you know. But also, I think what helped me is during the lockdown period, I was editing The Would Be Queen, and that's I really enjoy the editorial period, both with my editor Marcus and with the copy editor, the wonderful Lisa Rogers, and that's where I focus. That's where I really dig my fingers into the story. That's where I think that after I've had all of that input, that's when I turn it into something which I'm happy for people to read. So I had that 3 or 4 months of that going on, which was great. And yeah, just writing away at something new and waiting for that moment that it catches, which I think it now has, you know. So yeah, another couple of years, I'll have another one ready.
Yeah, we all work at our own pace, you know, and
yeah.
Often when the book is all shiny and finished, you can't see all the hours of agonizing and suffering that goes behind those pages.
Well, it's true, and I think as soon as I see the book, As soon as I know it's there, and now that I know it's been released today and that it's in the hands of readers and it's their story now and they can make of it what they will, I stop worrying about it until I actually open the book itself, which guaranteed that I will open it on the page where the one typo is named, and I will hone in on it, and also I think, but you know, the nice thing about having it out is I'm listening to the audiobook at the moment, which has been done by the wonderful Beth Eyre, who has done a really amazing job on it. And I love listening to my audiobooks because it's the only time that I hear the story that I've told without thinking about the mechanics and everything that I did to create the story. I suddenly step outside of it. And so I like hearing the audiobooks, and they're also great teachers as well, because I can hear, and I hear like a clunky sentence that got away or clunky paragraph, and I think, well, sorry for that one, you know, and you kind of do better the next time around. You carry it with you.
Joanne, I was going to say, do you like listening to your own work? Because I personally find it slightly cringeworthy.
Yeah, I don't listen to my audiobooks much. I don't
don't
listen
you
to
do
them all
your
the
own?
way through. I have done my own, yes. I've done quite a lot. I did the one for Honeycomb, and I did the one for A Pocket Full of Crows and The Strawberry Thief and Chocolat. Originally, I used to have the most wonderful audiobook readers, but all the audiobooks were abridged, and I just hated the abridgments so much that I just couldn't listen to them. Now, of course, audiobooks aren't abridged anymore, which is wonderful. And so I listen to sometimes I get a choice of readers and voices, and so I have a connection with them that way, and I talk to them. But no, I don't listen to them all the way through, because it is very different. Hearing somebody read your book aloud it's an interpretation. It's a very different interpretation in some cases, and I love them and I think they're great, but no, I don't always find it comfortable to listen to them. I love other audiobooks though, and I really enjoy audiobooks, and I think, like you, Ed, I've kind of rediscovered my love for them in lockdown, because I've had time to download them and enjoy them, and yeah, that's been one of the really nice things that I've discovered that I like doing, listening to readers read other people's work.
Oh, we have one more question in the box, and it's a good one. It's, do you have a favourite fairy tale from your childhood that has resonated with you?
Oh wow! Now searching my memory through all. I think I better let you answer this one, Joanne.
Oh well, I'll start then. My favourite fairy tale is The Pied Piper. I've always liked that fairy tale, and I've always loved the fact that it is linked to a historical event. I love the fact that it's very clear that, you know, there is a trickster character in there, and I love trickster characters. I write about them all the time. And I've also always wanted to write a story about the children who got left behind. The children, he pipes the children away under the hill. We don't know where the children have gone, but there is a lame boy and a blind girl who are left behind. And I have a whole book written in my mind about what happened to them and where they went, which one day will get written, I think, because it seems to be that theirs is the story that needs telling.
Hands up, who would read that? Definitely. I love that. I love that. And this is something that I did with Sister Song. You know, there are other people's stories in the margins of these famous ones that you don't hear. And it's the beauty of storytelling and the beauty of reinvention is that, you know, there is always going to be another story that has to be dug out and unearthed and retold.
Hansel and Gretel always stuck with me. It terrified me as a kid. The idea of being lost, I think, the abandonment. I think I might have had abandonment issues when I was a kid. But yeah, that I really didn't want them to go in. And the idea that somebody could be that young and innocent almost and be in that much peril kind of stuck with me. But, you know, I also used to be terrified of that Terry Gilliam cartoon of, do you remember the old lady with the black pram and And
Oh,
people used to
yes.
go, oh, let's look at the
He was
baby. And
terrifying.
the pram used to eat them.
Ooh.
You know. So
Yeah, he's a great example of somebody who is clearly influenced by this rich folklore we've got, and is not afraid of that dark imagery
that was the main. That could be a character straight out of a Grimm fairy tale. You know.
Well, there used to be a creature called a boggart in Lancashire folklore, and I used to hear stories of the boggart from my grandfather, and she was an old woman with a bonnet, and you used to pass her on the road. The whole you'd just see a little old lady with a bonnet, with a poke, and then you'd turn round and you'd find there was nothing inside the bonnet. And he would tell me these stories about having met the boggart, and then she would run after you, she would chase you, and you'd have to get away. And sometimes in the story she would be carrying her head in a basket, and she just looked like a little old lady coming back from. I've scared you now, haven't I, Edward?
Yeah.
It's
he's backing away.
I used to love those stories. I used to love them, but I also believed in them implicitly. And I was convinced. There was an old lady who lived next door to my grandfather in France, a lady called Madame Fourage, who was very, very old, and who wore the typical Breton poke bonnet. And I was sure she was a boggart in disguise, and that one day I would look at her and there would be no face inside the bonnet. This never happened, and I was quite disappointed.
Disappointed? Yeah, I would have been quite relieved. But this is interesting, because we talk about fairy tales of old, but I think modern tales, as we're talking about here, where I live, I'm quite close to a place called Borley Rectory, and Borley Rectory has this huge history of being one of the most haunted places in Britain. Now, the stories are probably all rubbish, but there's one story about a nun who died there, and she walks around the grounds, and it's a nun without a face. Now, no, it's a nun who was murdered there. Now, the thing about that story, the detail about that story that sends shivers down my spine, is not the fact that there was a nun without a face, which is scary enough, but it's the fact that the people who lived in Borley Rectory, because the rectory burnt down and got built up back into a house, that the people who lived there saw the nun out of the window, and got so frightened by it that they bricked up the windows. Now,
Wow.
the thing is that we used to go and visit Borley Rectory to see if we could see ghosts, and the police would just come away and say, piss off. But the weirdest thing is in the night, seeing Borley Rectory and seeing that, yes, the windows have been bricked up.
And this is the power of stories.
Yeah.
If a story can make you brick the windows of your rectory, then it's obviously got some traction somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I'm realizing now we're sharing all these stories, what dark little childhoods we had.
And on that note, I think we're almost at 8 o'clock. So
oh wow.
I know it's just it's gone amazingly fast. But as Anna's typed in the chat there, you can buy a signed copy of Honeycomb and The Would-Be Queen from Transreal Bookshop. Support indie. Woo!
Yes.
But the cover art is by the same person. It's by Gollantz's lovely Sue Gent, which is another strange little crossover coincidence. But she totally deserves a shout out because she's great. Oh,
definitely. She loved that cover. I was blown away with what she's done. Both covers, they just look. She's excelled herself. Well done, Sue.
Shout out to remember your illustrators.
Absolutely.
Well, I can't think of a better place to end this evening than with a few of Joanne's own words. And she said, such stories, like the ones in Honeycomb, are all part of a larger narrative, that of our shared experience, the story of our hopes and dreams. So I want to say a big thank you to Joanne M. Harris and Edward Cox, and also thank you to you all for coming along tonight.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lucy. Thank you, Ed. Thank you, everybody, for being here.